Welcome back to the Football Fitness Federation podcast. This is episode 83. I'm delighted today to be joined by two guests. We've got Richard Evans, the head of team and individual fitness with Belgium, and also Russell Hitchen, the lecturer in sports medicine at UCLAN University, but also physiotherapist at Manchester United Academy. So lads, thank you very much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for inviting us.
It's
absolute
great
pleasure, Ben. Absolute pleasure.
It's great to have you both on, and we'll try and direct the conversation as best as we can with the three of us. We have got a little lag on the signal right now, but we'll see how it goes. But just start us off. Let's start with Richard. I've just mentioned your current role, what you're doing, and we just said then that you've come under many different titles, but we'll use your official one there. Well, just talk us through your career so far, where you've been, and the roles that you've had.
Wow, how long do you want? Because in reflection and preparing for this podcast, I think I'll go back 21 seasons. So my first encounter with working as a member of staff was at Swansea City in 1998, 1999. I was coming to the end of my sports science degree at Loughborough, and I said to my wife at the time, it must have been about April, coming into the final stages, preparing for the exams. And I said to my wife, I don't know what I'm going to do after this. At the moment, it all looks as if I'm going to become a fitness coach in a gym somewhere, or I might have to do an extra year to become a PE teacher. So I don't really know what I'm going to do. And then a phone call out of the blue, a chap that I met on the treatment and management of injuries course at the FA at Lilleshall recommended me to John Hollins, the manager of Swansea City at the time. So I did the treatment and management of injuries, and that link enabled the phone call to come through to me. And then the question was, do I want to become the sports therapist at Swansea City? So not knowing too much about the role at the time, I dived straight in, and whilst I was finishing my finals at Loughborough, I was running on the pitch for Swansea City at the end of that 1998-1999 season. So it was out of the frying pan and into the fire, really. It was an amazing experience, obviously, to go from student life to running on the pitch on the Saturday afternoon as a sports therapist. It was quite daunting at first, but obviously settled in quite nicely. I'm still here to tell the tale.
Awesome. And then where did you go from there, Richard? Where did your career take you from there?
Well, I was there for 10 years, which was most probably what I call the learning years, really, because I had 10 years where initially, in those days, the staff were basically made up of a manager, assistant manager, and a dog's body that was the physiotherapist, the sports scientist, the nutritionist, the kit man, the warm-up man, and everything else. So that was my role, really. And then I had 5 years of working in a squad at the bottom end of the second division, or the third division then, with an aging squad. Not many players wanted to come and play for Swansea City at the time, obviously playing at the old Vetchfield Stadium. So it was hard work, basically, because I had to look after all those players from first team, reserves, and youth team for myself for 5 years, basically, and I had the help of two unbelievable general practitioners that came in at part-time. So those 5 years, I was basically running on the pitch, taking the players off, taking them to the MRI scanner, which was the closest one was in Cardiff. Then if they needed to go on to see any further intervention, I'd have to take them up to London or Bristol to see a consultant. So basically took them off the pitch, guide them through the initial stages of the injury, and then obviously had to do the return to play with them and then get them back on the pitch again. So, and such a small squad with very limited resources, I learned very quickly that, everything had to be perfect for them with limited resources. So I didn't want them to come back out of the squad because we couldn't afford it. And then that would also mean that then I would basically have more work. So I had to make sure I perfected, the diagnosis, the subacute phases, the return to play, and then the functional rehab to get them back into coping with the demands of play. And so those 5 years were, I think, very critical in my career, and understanding of how physiotherapy and sports science marry very well together.
Russ, do you want to just take us through your career so far? So where you started out and where you've been?
Yeah, so I started off doing my physio degree at Salford Uni on a part-time basis, and I was playing non-league at the time. I was playing at Hinckley and then Vauxhall Motors, and I was coming to the last year of my degree, and I realised that I needed to get some experience because it's a competitive field to get into, really, kind of sports physio. So I got a call from the Fleetwood manager at the time and said their physio had just left. He knew I was coming to the end of my degree. Did I fancy being Fleetwood's physio? So they were in the Conference North at the time. So I was doing that, finishing my degree. And then I asked Richie, as I'm from Wigan, local team, could I go and do a placement there at Wigan? So I got a placement in at Wigan. Seemed to do quite well, I would have thought, or certainly seemed to have impressed. And then Richie kindly offered me a job when a job became available full time. So I started off with the youth team at Wigan. We didn't have necessarily the support with the youth team. There was just the coach, David Watson, and myself as the physio. That was kind of it. So a bit similar to Richie, how he explained his role at Swansea. You know, you kind of ended up being the dog's body for everything for that team. Doing the warm-ups, doing the conditioning, doing the rehab, taking players everywhere. And then we had a reserve team squad as well. And they asked me if I could get involved with the reserve team squad. So it was quite pretty full on, kind of my first role full time, but it was excellent. The amount I learned at the time was fantastic, and working under Richie and the coaching staff were very patient and kind of gave me that football experience as well. In that environment, which was fantastic. And we had a reasonable, successful season in terms of getting a couple of players through and results with the reserves and the youth team. And the manager, Roberto, pulled me into his office, and Richie did, and said, how do you fancy working with the first team? So I got promoted into that role, and then I was in that role then for 6 seasons. So I had 2 seasons with the youth team and 6 seasons working with the first team. So yeah, it was a very good learning curve, and kind of progressed my way up through the club at Wigan. When Roberto left, we then had another 4. I worked under another 4 managers after the 4 successive seasons, and the last 2 seasons as head physio at the club. So I've seen quite a big change in terms of working. I was very fortunate to go in when the club was in the Premier League. And then we kind of worked our way down to Championship, League One, back up to Championship. So yeah, it was excellent experience. It was very good. And then from then, I've moved into a lecturing role at UCLAN University. So I lecture on the sports medicine degree, and I've also working at Manchester United part-time, doing the rehab clinic, and then also covering games with the academy. And it's been quite interesting, really, because it's kind of come back on itself, working with kind of the youth team, then with senior players with the first team, and now with the youngsters, all 9s to 16s at United. And they're quite a different population, the adolescent population, in terms of injuries that they get, communication you need to use with them players, considering parents, safeguarding, and the coaching staff as well. So yeah, it's definitely broadened my skills, the position that I'm in at the moment. So yeah, it's been good, been interesting, and continuing to carry on the path where it'll lead, nobody knows, but just keep learning, and I'm trying to broaden my experiences and keep developing.
And that's one thing I was going to ask yourself, Russell, about that transition from full-time football to part-time, but the lecturing side as well. So how have you found that, and what's been some big differences?
In terms of differences, football's all about results and pressure, like a pressure type of industry. There is still that pressure at academic level, but it's more about meeting deadlines and standard of work being acceptable at that level, and trying to get as much engagement as you can from your students, trying to provide the best experience that they can do, that we can provide. I think working in football and now working my academic studies with working in football part-time, it's good to give students case study based scenarios that are real life, that I can put on and kind of get them to discuss situations, presentations of players, You know, what would you do within this stage of rehab? How would you manage the coach in this situation? And another thing it's done as well is it's made me go back to basics in terms of really understanding fundamentals of anatomy, pathology, rehabilitation, fitness principles, and then building up on that as well, and also linking to research papers that you know, that kind of underpin our modules and our curriculum, and then also guiding our research as well with our students that we're working with.
And Richard, we didn't get onto your, obviously you both had time at Wigan together, which we're going to come back to in a little bit, because we'll dive into some of the work that you guys did at Wigan. But just skipping on to your current role, do you want to just give us a little breakdown about, we just had a little laugh about your title, but what does it involve?
I better fast forward first, and I was left at Swansea City then, wasn't I? So another 5 years after I started, I basically I took it in my own initiative to do the physiotherapy degree as well, because at Swansea at the time we were still getting injuries, so I wanted to understand the injury mechanism a little bit more. So I thought the physiotherapy degree would give me that opportunity to do that and go back with a better knowledge of the player, obviously from a physical point of view and a medical point of view. And during that period after the physiotherapy degree, the players were still coming in and getting injured. So I basically reversed the role and concentrated more on the physical side of things, and basically thought that, you know, fit players don't get injured. And we worked closely, and that's where mostly Roberto Martinez comes into the scene then in 2003. He brought the professionalism into the club as a player. And I was able then to understand more of how physiotherapy and sports science marry well together to help the player develop into, you know, the physical demands of professional football. How to get through 90 minutes at the best they possibly can achieve, really. So then obviously I ended up with Wigan and through to Everton, and then Roberto gets the job at Belgium. So the journey's been over a long period of time, but it's been a very valuable one in terms of learning and meeting people from different departments with different disciplines. But to end up with Team Belgium and obviously working towards a tournament like the World Cup, which we did very well in 2018. It's been an amazing experience, really, and some, you know, highlights along the way. You know, obviously championships, going to a tournament in the World Cup, and obviously FA Cup final with Wigan, which was really momentous. And I think that's what we all work for. You know, we work ultimately to help the players be the best they possibly can. And then obviously we work for those moments as well to be involved with. You know, they're priceless.
Yeah, definitely. And I was going to ask as well, in terms of your transition into international football now, what are some differences or differences in challenges that you face in terms of working with the international players against working full-time in what was Premier League and, well, at Wigan and all the clubs?
Well, it's a completely different demand. Obviously, we've got a squad of 40 players that we, you know, keep a constant eye on, and obviously they come from 8 different leagues across the world. So obviously, communication is the key point there. Is basically trying to understand the players, trying to understand the roles and that they're given at their clubs. Try to communicate with the clubs as much as you can, because obviously we're lending their players for 5 times during the season. We need to know as much about their players as possible, because it all stemmed from our frustrations when we were working at Wigan and Everton. Our international players would go away on international duty, and we wouldn't know what they were doing from the moment they left us after the Premier League game on the Saturday or the Sunday till when they come back the following Wednesday, Thursday. You know, we had no idea of intensities that they were undertaking, what travel, what nutrition. There was no information at all. So when I first started at Belgium, that was one of the clearest things that I had in my mind that we had to bridge, is that gap between club and country. Because obviously in the press and managers come out and say they're not happy with the way the internationals have been treating our players. So I try to, you know, create a clarity between club and country, and I feel as if I've achieved that very well, because now I've got a great collaboration with the majority of the the clubs all across the world. I've been able to go and visit each training ground, meet the staff behind the player, meet the environment behind the player. So what type of equipment they use, what type of training method. Everyone trains in a totally different way. You know, there's no one size that fits all. It's basically each manager has got their different philosophy, and basically marrying all those players into Roberto Martinez way at the Belgium national team. So it's been a great transition from club to country. It's been obviously we get less time with the players, but in between we get more time to plan the camps that we have.
And I wanted to ask you both, because looking from the outside, and obviously a lot of people will know about Roberto Martinez and his style of play, his philosophy, but working very closely with him that you both have, what have been some biggest takeaways from whether it's as a person or as a coach? And Russ, we'll start with yourself and then we'll move on to Richard.
Yeah, I mean, Richard's worked with Roberto for a much longer period than myself, but one of the refreshing things I found working with him, that his knowledge, his physical knowledge in terms of, because he does have a physiotherapy degree, in terms of you can have good conversations with him, good clinical conversations. He's well aware of what preparations players need to make physically for games. He understands the rehab process, and if you had a long-term injured player, and you know, we was kind of having our MDT meetings and feeding back and kind of planning when players would be returning, he was quite open to conversations that you could have with him. And in terms of integrating players back into training, he would listen to what we was asking for in terms of integrating players, say after a hamstring injury. They would kind of go through the rehab phase, and they would go through the return to play phase with Richard, and then they would kind of get integrated into training. And Richard will probably talk a bit more about this later on, in terms of planning training for individually for that player returning back with a game in mind for what they wanted. He didn't he never micromanaged. He made it clear what he wanted from us in terms of expectations, and it was up to us to get on with things really and deliver in terms of what he was asking for. I think from my experience, because Roberto was my first manager at, you know, a senior professional level, I probably didn't realise at the time in terms of that collaboration work that we had with the manager until he left. And then we worked under other managers who have different philosophies, different ways of working. And I can truly say that Roberto was the best manager that I worked for in terms of from a physio point of view, in terms of relaying information with that. And the way that we collaborated together was very well. And I'm sure Richard will probably give us a bit more detail because Richard worked with him closer.
Well, I go back 17 years with him when he came to us at Swansea City in 2003 to help us stay in the league at the time. And I did the medical on him, and I went back to my wife. I'd been in football since leaving school, and I basically said to her then, I said, you know, I met someone today, he's completely different. I don't know why he's different, but he's different in the way that he speaks about the game, his passion for the game, his knowledge of the tactics behind the game. And this was like on initial medical that we did on him. I said he's completely different, and he's turned out to be that person. Really, his charisma, his personality lit up Swansea City. His professionalism brought the most out of the players that he was playing with at the time. And he basically put Swansea on an upward curve as a player, and then went to come back as a manager. All those principles that he had, he instilled in the squads that he worked with. And his basic premise was, how can we make the player better? How can we make the individual perform at a better performance than what he did in the previous? So we were always searching to make, you know, the training more effective, understanding the individual through data, through subjective, objective. How can we make the most of that player? How can we make him better? How can we fit him into Roberto's tactics on a Saturday afternoon to make the team better? So it was always every aspect, technical, tactical, physical, and also mental, were all worked on every single player, really. So it was always a player-centered approach. And then obviously the team then, you know, came together through the week and then performed on a Saturday afternoon.
And I know you've probably touched on this a little bit already, but and you can sort of repeat what you possibly said previously and add anything to it. And we'll start with yourself, Richard. But always like to ask, in terms of a well-functioning department, a department where people can have views and opinions, things can be questioned, and hopefully we get results at the end of it as well. What do you see as some key principles within that department?
I think it has to be an understanding of everybody's roles. And as I said, I had to do a sports science degree, I had to do a physiotherapy degree because I needed to understand the both disciplines. I was working on my own, basically. So then when you get put into those departments, you understand the intricacies of those disciplines and how, when they do work well together, when they do come together, how effective it can be. But as I said, when it breaks down, it can become quite detrimental, because basically you've got people with different opinions, different backgrounds, different ways of working. But I think if you're as one, you've got a common goal and you all want to work together, you all appreciate each other's disciplines, you're positive, that can only benefit the player in the long run. The player needs to see a positive approach from everybody, saying the same thing, repeatedly. You can't have people undermining a certain opinion, a certain way of doing something. You have to have a group of people that have got a common goal, that want to make the best out of a player.
And Russ, what about yourself? Is it similar? Are you going to echo the same sort of thoughts, or is there anything extra you can think of in terms of a well-functioning department?
I just think we collaborated very well in terms of communication pathways that we had was key. In terms of our message that we was communicating with players and to the coaching staff was key, and making sure that we're delivering the same message. I think one thing that we did have working at Wigan was that we always knew we was going to be in a relegation fight, and we seemed to work comfortably with that pressure, and we knew what the season would entail, and coming towards the end of the season, we know that every player needed to be available. And the fact that seasons seem to replicate themselves season after season, we tend to start off okay, then we'd have a dip in form, Christmas period would be over, and then we go on an exceptional run towards the end of the season and survive in the Premier League. So we seem to be comfortable in terms of working that way, and obviously wanting to improve. We did, like Richard spoke on before, we did have that individual approach with players. And I think also, like in the afternoons, so we'd work with the team and players during the day and after lunchtime, and then in the afternoons we'd be doing our notes and reviewing data. And we had quite an open office in terms of, coming into reflective practice. We'd recognise what was working well and what wasn't working well, or what players needed to be topped up, and we'd have them discussions. And then, we would put an action plan in place, and we would physically work with them players one-to-one, or however we needed to change things, within our working days. And then we kind of reflect on it again and see if it improved. And it was a continuous cycle, really, of trying to get better, trying to improve performance of individuals.
And I know we can go into some detail now on a specific case study that you both worked and were part of, and with a really, I know Richard talked about one of the biggest successes in your career being the FA Cup victory, and this involves the goal scorer in the cup final. So do you want to just give us a little bit of background, Richard, to start with? We're talking about Ben Watson. We're talking about he got injured in the season. So do you want to start on the injury and then the sort of process and tie in as well how the department works so well together?
Yeah, so it all stems from a meeting myself and Russ had a couple of years ago. I was asked to do a talk about the culture of the team behind the team. And I didn't realize up until the point that myself and Russ met that I said, well, maybe we should, I'll be able to talk about Ben Watson. What do you think? Because I said, basically, we took him from, the broken leg at Anfield right the way through. And I said, what were the intricacies of how we all worked together? And obviously Russ went away and he put a presentation together. And then when we all sat down together again to look at what he presented, it was, wow, that was amazing. So it's only in reflection that we had, we had 7 members of staff between 53 players. We had a great, meetings every single morning. We discussed every protocol for every single player that was that needed. And Ben obviously came into the forefront because obviously we had a small squad. He got injured against Liverpool in November, so you start, immediately thinking, will he make the end of the season? Obviously, my experience at Swansea, maximising every single player for every single minute that they could possibly contribute. I thought, well, there's 6 months left of the season. So this puts Ben on the verge of, do we, say that's the end of your season, Ben, or do we just see if we can actually get him to compete in one of the games? It might make a difference. So I run on the pitch. Obviously, Raheem Sterling clashes into Ben mid-air, and I was thinking at the time mechanism of injury shouldn't be too bad, so I ran on. So after about a minute and a half, the pain didn't go away, so I ended up stretching Ben off. He goes straight down to Liverpool Royal Infirmary, and he gets diagnosed with a transverse fracture of the right tibia. And we're thinking, as I said, wow, we're going to lose a very influential player. So I'm sure Russ now can take us through. Obviously, the decision was basically, no, we'll just keep on working with Ben until until either the season peters out or we can get him back on the pitch. Obviously, professionally, 6 months is going to be touch and go. So we went on a positive approach with Ben, and Ben was quite happy to go through it as well. We treated every single day like a first team player, but obviously he's limited in terms of what he could do because of the injury. So we still give him the same rhythm of the week, for a traditional training method. So Monday was like a second day recovery. Tuesday was high intensity. So we went through that week with him with what he could manage. So we went obviously through the acute phases, which I'm sure Russell will look forward to divulging now.
Yeah, so initially it was kind of management. Do we go for conservative management, or do we need to have a medulla rod put in to the tibia? And with the position of the fracture and it being a transverse fracture, the consultant recommended that we could manage this conservatively. So it was put in plaster of Paris on minimal weight bearing just to compress the fracture site a little bit. And we had a discussion with the strength and conditioning coach at the time, so Gareth Piper, and looked at some research about cross-education muscle activation. So we started doing a lot of strengthening work on his good leg, hoping that he'll develop neural pathways into his injured leg and try and maintain some form of muscular function out of that leg. So that was when we was at a period we could work that leg, his muscle hypertrophy and function and proprioception would come back much quicker. So we kind of went through a 4-week program of doing some heavy strengthening work on his good leg, and then we was very keen to get him out of the cast as soon as we could do. We didn't want to be unsafe, but we also didn't want to lose ankle range of movement, particularly dorsiflexion being in the plaster of Paris. So our consultations, we were kind of trying to persuade them to put him in an Urcast boot so we could do some ankle molds, maintain ankle dorsiflexion, and then also do some soft tissue work, because we didn't want the callus formation to interfere with any kind of soft tissue structures, particularly soleus, plantaris, gastroc, etc. And then also his dorsiflexors at the front of the shin. So our soft tissue therapist would work with him. So we'd take him out of the boot, we'd do some good soft tissue work, some treatment on his leg, he'd go back into the boot, and then we would start trying to load safely the fracture site, to compress the fracture site, to make it a stronger callus formation in there. So when it mineralized and going through remodeling phases, it was as strong as it could be. When we was able to come out of the boot, we then looked at trying to increase proprioception, get his gait to be normal. So, just doing very basic like marching type drills over hurdles, doing static balance, then dynamic type balance, and then strengthening his injured leg to make sure all his major muscle groups are working, eccentrically, concentrically, isometrically. And then progressing out to them acute and subacute phases then into kind of looking at his return to play strategy in terms of managing his gym rehab, and then also trying to get him out on the grass. So we did get him out on the grass at the safe time, and we noticed he had quite a reasonable antalgic gait when he was running. So Richie pulled him in because he could kind of. It was always good to have different eyes. You know, I'd take Ben on some occasions. Richie would take him on other occasions. Gaz, the S&C coach, would take him on some occasions. So, you know, different sets of eyes on the player. We could always feed back to each other and kind of express what we thought, where we was going, and any concerns that we had. So, so you pulled him in, Richie, didn't you? And
yeah, I wasn't happy with his progress because obviously he still had this visible limp, and everybody's around the training ground was saying, well, what, Ben's limping, what's he doing outside? Like, so we bring him in, we put him on the treadmill, and we just look at his gait. Obviously, there was no 3D analysis in those days or afforded to Wigan Athletics, so we basically use our eyes, and we could see that his obviously hip hitch. We could see that obviously the limp was quite evident, so we actually put him on the bed as well and looked at leg length, and he had a functional leg length discrepancy, which I got a bit worried about because I thought it was from the fracture side, but I was thinking it can't be a fracture side because it was a stable fracture. So we looked at obviously the tissues in and around the hip, and obviously because he'd been on crutches, he had this flexion deformity that he developed by being on the crutches. So we did, Alison Haslam then did a load of soft tissue work on, released all the tissues. So then we started to be able to go back into the re-education of his movement again, and obviously the limp started to disappear slowly over time. So that was a breakthrough for us really, because it was preventing him from pushing on. So then we basically give him more CV work, give him more functional and position specific exercises on the training ground. But then he still had, he still couldn't be able to absorb ground forces, ground reaction forces. So we worked a lot of single leg work with, obviously with Gaz Piper. They work heavily on the strength and the power of the right leg. And then you could see that he was tolerating pretty much everything then. So it was a matter of how do we release him? Our return to play protocol was a basic jump mat. We wanted him to jump off his injured leg as well as the non-injured, basically. And at first, when we tested, it was a 40% difference. So we had this ongoing weekly test with Ben through the latter stages of his rehabilitation. We wouldn't really release him until he got to 5%. So it was more back in the gym, back on the training ground, reinforcing the exercises that were starting to work. And then he got to the stage then where he got to 5%, jumping off his right foot, exactly the same as the left. So I was happy then to let him play in a reserve game, an under-21 game at Wigan. I think everybody had their reservations, but I stood strong. I was happy with his overall fitness and his preparation and every effort that everybody put into him. And he came through the half, given 45 minutes because we wanted to build him up to 45, 60. We were running out of games. Obviously, we were bottom of the Premier League at the time. And Ben actually played against West Brom as his first game with only three weeks left of the season. So it was an amazing opportunity to get him back in and feature. We were still holding our head above water. He played in the 3-2 win against West Brom, which gave us hope that we could stay in the league. But in the meantime, our FA Cup run was getting longer and longer and longer, end up in the semi-finals against Hull. And then into the final against Man City. Amazing journey for us all, really. And then obviously Ben coming off the bench to score the winning goal in the FA Cup final, jumping off his right foot to head the goal in off the corner, was an amazing end to a rehabilitation process that identified every single discipline that we had, and the input that everybody gave him all came out in that one movement. Obviously, I'm not saying that we won the FA Cup, but obviously the tactics and Ben's desire and will to get back on the pitch again was phenomenal. And to score the goal in that manner that he did was just an amazing feeling.
Yeah. So just going back to kind of the jumping that Ben was doing, it was ironic that he ended up jumping off his injured leg to score the goal. But the amount of jumps that we did as part of his rehab, the main thing at first was his movement, his kind of kinesthetic movement of jumping was all over the place. He couldn't triple extend properly. So we got him in the gym. We started doing some triple extension exercises, then kind of single leg triple extension exercises, and then working through his rate of force development, working through plyometric training and kind of his principles of plyometric training. And then developing that then not only into jumping but sprinting, so doing his sledge runs, and then also being able to decelerate and accept load and change direction. So we did quite a few agility drills with him, and then kind of perturbation, knocking him off balance, changing direction. So it was mainly between myself and Richie towards right at the end in terms of rehab that we were doing, in dipping into training and then doing his conditioning with Richie and managing his training load. And we weren't blessed with resources. Our jump mat was our friend, wasn't it, Richie? So we single leg counter movement jump was our main outcome measure for him. We did use the IKD, but right at the end at Bolton University. So we had an agreement with Bolton University that we would take students for placements as long as we could have access to the performance lab, which had an IKD. With Ben having a tibial fracture and it kind of being conservative management, we didn't want to use that earlier on because of open chain exercises putting stress on the fracture site. So we only used it really right at the end. But yeah, like Richie said, our main outcome measure was the jump test really, and it proved well for us, as well as measuring muscle girth, etc. But yeah, the jump test was the main one. Getting within that 5% was definitely the key for his return.
And I know you said, Richard, about when he first got injured, it was going to be hard to see like when the return date was. And I know with an injury, it's always a tough one to give a specific date. But as that competition's going on and you're seeing the winning games in the FA Cup and getting to crunch time in the season, what was it like managing him? Because he's obviously going to have big aspirations to step back into a game, especially when you get to a final. How was it managing the player as well?
Well, I think we never really thought we were going to go to the FA Cup final anyway. I think we were more concerned about staying in the league, and it was all about obviously trying to get him to obviously take part in possibly the last couple of league games, and maybe affect the last couple of league games to stay in the league. So it was never an emphasis on getting him back to play in any specific game at all. It was just basically, can we get him to play? And to be fair to him, he stuck by it. He could have easily said, look, I'm not going to make this season and I'm going to get back for the last game of the season. What's the point? But with Ben, he worked solid through those 6 months, really. We had to give him a couple of weeks off, obviously, because the monotony and seeing the lads playing week in, week out was quite frustrating. And it also gives us an opportunity to send them away to some sunshine, and because there's not much sun up northwest, is there, obviously. So he went abroad and obviously got the vitamin D that he needed to help the bone formation, which was and it give him a good chance to obviously recover from some of the sessions that we were working with him, really, and mentally and physically, shut down to come back stronger again. So they worked really well in his phase of rehabilitation.
I think quite a key question for a lot of the listeners that are S&C sports scientists, that seems to be the majority of our listeners, would be the sort of end stage rehab. You touched on before where you started incorporating some position specific drills, and that's obviously when he's going to be getting back in with the team as well. So what did that look like?
Well, because of obviously prozone and analysis at the time, we could basically break down some of the functional movements that Ben would create in the game. And midfield players will have a typical pattern. Ben, we knew, would perform around 60 to 80 passes per game. He had a good aerobic capacity. He would cover 11.5 to 12 K per game. He wasn't the fastest, but obviously his mental understanding of the game, put him into some great positions. So we looked at those movement patterns specifically that tried to replicate exactly what we would do, so that we had more confidence about going from the training ground and back into a game. So we kept on, if it was 40%, 50%, 60% intensity, it was still going through those movement patterns, even though it wasn't fine-tuned, it wasn't with a good acceleration or deceleration, it was just basically movement patterns. So it wasn't flat out, it wasn't going to overload the area at all, it was purely just to get that thinking processes again, the whole body working and thinking at the same time, and getting those processes working together.
And Ross,
I think as well.
Sorry, mate, go
on. Like Richard touched on it in terms of the movement patterns. What we'd often do is set out a lot of poles in kind of a track that he would cover in a game. So whether it were forwards, backwards, sideways, then a spin off his left shoulder and an acceleration, and we'd incorporate that as part of his aerobic. He was working for 15 seconds on his aerobic capacity. He would do his 15 seconds, but following that movement pattern. So he was getting used to kind of accelerating, decelerating, turning off his shoulder, just getting familiar with his body movement, really, in particular, rather than just keeping everything and all his conditioning straight line, which seemed to work well. And then bringing in players, so he would have to react off, a physical stimulus of a defender being, or an opponent being around him, or receiving the ball in a certain way. And his integration into training as a floating player, and then building into his, passing drills and possession games. It wasn't, it was then back to being second nature to him. It wasn't a new experience to him, really.
And then what about any other challenges along the way? You've obviously said about where Richard wasn't happy in terms of his gait, in terms of his movement. Was there anything else that you guys came across that you had to tackle?
I think that was the main one, really. I think, as I said, it got to a point where he wasn't progressing, and without the limp, and it was basically stripping him back down again and understanding where that limp was actually coming from. And obviously, by us all standing there watching him and coming up with a formula and understanding of why he had that limp, it basically furthered our knowledge in the area, and we had to put more input into the exercises specific to obviously releasing the tissues, lengthening the tissues, strengthening the tissues. So that was the main thing, and obviously Ben's determination to get back as well was the player buy-in, as they call it, into what we were trying to do and what we were trying to achieve was, that goes a long way as well. He's a great person to work with.
I think psychologically as well, going back into challenging for a ball and being tackled and being nudged. We tried to introduce it as quickly as we could do, but in a safe environment that we could do. So first of all, it was just kind of in tackling, a static medicine ball. Can you just slowly and gently tap the medicine ball so you're getting that feedback into your leg, and then just progressing from there, tackling against myself, or because I was a defender back in my day when I was a kid. So, but then also him, getting used to tackling, being tackled, jumping. We spoke a lot about jumping, but getting challenged in the aerial challenge and being able to land and then push off from that, and developing his confidence within that. And then when he went back into training, intensity of training and being nudged and being taken off balance and tackling, it wasn't a big, it wasn't as big a step up for him to move into that. It was a natural progression of his rehab to move into them scenarios, really, of that unpredictability and being able to withstand it and react to different situations.
I think there was more apprehension on our behalf when he first went into a tackle in the game than what he had anyway. He certainly didn't show any signs of flinching or pulling out of a tackle at all. It was more from our, watching through your fingers, basically. So no, he never really had anything other than obviously that antalgic gait that we picked up on. But it was great to work with.
And just in terms of practitioners, obviously, when a player gets injured like that, you probably always got in mind that first game back is going to be a real like you're gonna get a good feeling of the player getting back on the pitch and doing what they love. But he's not only done that, but like Russ has touched on, he's basically used one of the monitoring tests to score the winning goal in the cup final. So just to reflect on you guys as practitioners, like that must have been one hell of a feeling for you both.
No, I was actually looking at the presentation, and there's a clip at the end of the game where he gets interviewed about, obviously, Ben Watson, you had a broken leg, and then he goes on to describe how grateful he was to the people that he worked around over those 6 months, and they were dark and they were fraught with frustration, but this his dreams come true. So that encapsulates that end of that interview encapsulates everything. There's not one person that was mentioned. It was basically a group of people that were the people behind him, obviously creating one of the best moments in his playing career, really.
I think from my physio point of view, I used to get a lot of enjoyment through players returning back to play quicker, or giving them the opportunity to come back a little bit quicker, and then also saving players' careers, not losing players to a serious injury. So them two situations both occurred at, probably, certainly in my career, the biggest platform in my career. So yeah, it was an amazing feeling, but also knowing that we kind of, as a department, we come well together and collaboratively. It paid off, and like Richard said at the beginning of the case study, really, I think it was only when we kind of sat down and reflected on it when we were doing a presentation on it later on, how things came together, and we probably did well. And I link back to when you was asking me what comes to a functional department, having good communication and reflective practice, and making sure you're heading in the right direction is key, really. And that was very evident with Ben's throughout Ben's injury.
I think this has been amazing, because we've spoke a hell of a lot in a lot of episodes about communication, about effective departments, but this has been with the case study, it's been a real great, amazing insight into how you guys have worked and how the whole team's worked together, and with an unbelievable outcome as well. So lads, I'm not going to take up any more of your evening. I really, really do appreciate you coming on. A big thank you for both of you for coming on. But is there anywhere if anyone's got any questions, can they reach out, or is there anywhere that they can do that?
Well, I'm on Twitter, so I'm at PhysEvs. So you can find me on Twitter. I'm happy to discuss anything on there. I'm hopefully of an age with lots of experience, and I'm more than happy to share or discuss any topic at all regarding football. So no, I'm happy to be contacted anyway.
What about yourself, Russ?
Yeah, myself, my Twitter is @Russ_Hitchen. So yeah, either send me a tweet through that, or if you're interested in terms of, from the education point of view, we do have some webinars, some online presentations, and we run some CPD courses as well. So my email for the uni is rhitchen@uclan.ac.uk.
Awesome. Well, I do really appreciate you coming on. Big thank you for giving up your time, and we'll hopefully catch up soon.
Cheers, Ben.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks, lads.